Creativity, Inc. by Ed Catmull. Picture this. You've just spent 2 solid years pouring your heart and soul into something special. Not just any project. We're talking about a sequel to one of the most beloved films ever made, Toy Story 2. Hundreds of artists, engineers, and storytellers have invested thousands of hours building this world, frame by digital frame. Woody, Buzz, Mr. Potato Head. They're practically family at this point. The entire film lives on a complex network of computer drives, a universe of data representing every color, every movement, every line of dialogue. Then, one ordinary afternoon, someone enters a single line of code. An animator glances at their screen and watches in absolute horror as Woody's hat simply disappears, then his boots. Then, in the blink of an eye, Woody himself is gone. The other characters follow, one by one, vanishing into a digital void. Mr. Potato Head, Ham, Rex, poof. Whole sequences, meticulously crafted over months, are being erased. Someone frantically calls the systems department. "Pull the plug," they scream. "Just pull it now!" But it's already too late. In a matter of seconds, 90% of the movie, representing 2 years of work, has been deleted, wiped clean. Now imagine you're Ed Catmull, president of Pixar. This isn't just a setback, it's the kind of catastrophe that could sink the entire studio. But what happens next? That's where the real story begins. It's not just about recovering a lost film. It's about discovering the hidden principles that allow a team to survive the unsurvivable, to face down disaster without blame, and to build one of the most creative cultures the world has ever seen. This is the world of Creativity, Inc., written by the man at the center of it all, Ed Catmull. This book isn't just Pixar's story, it's a map. It's a guide to the unseen forces that stand in the way of true inspiration, whether you're making a movie, starting a business, or simply trying to bring a new idea to life. Today, we're going to open that map together. By the end of our journey, you'll understand the profound and often counterintuitive lessons Ed Catmull learned over a lifetime of building and sustaining a creative powerhouse. You'll discover why the best ideas start as ugly babies, why failure isn't just an option but a necessity, and how to build a team that can not only weather the storm but learn to sail in it. This is more than a summary. It's a journey into the heart of what it truly means to be creative. Every great story starts with a dream. And for young Ed Catmull, growing up in the 1950s, that dream had a name: Walt Disney. Every Sunday night, he'd sit on his living room floor, completely mesmerized as Walt himself appeared on their little black and white TV. Disney wasn't just showing cartoons. He was pulling back the curtain on magic itself. He'd explain how sound was synchronized in Steamboat Willie, or how music brought Fantasia to life. He showed a world where art and technology weren't just partners, they were soulmates. Ed had 2 heroes back then: Walt Disney, the master of inventing the new, and Albert Einstein, the master of explaining what already was. Disney represented art. Einstein represented science, and for Ed, they embodied the 2 poles of human creativity. He was fascinated by both, but Disney's world felt like home. He wanted to be an animator, to create characters that felt alive, that could make you believe a wooden puppet or a talking mouse was a thinking, feeling being. He made flipbooks, bought art kits, even built his own animation stand. But harsh reality soon set in. He realized he just wasn't talented enough. He couldn't draw like the masters at Disney. It felt like his dream had hit a dead end. So he made a choice that would change his life, and eventually change the world of film forever. If he couldn't reach his dream through the front door of art, he'd build a new door with the tools of science. He turned to physics and a brand new field called computer science. He didn't know it then, but this wasn't a detour, it was his destiny. At the University of Utah, a hotbed of innovation in the early days of computing, Ed quietly set a new goal for himself. It was audacious, almost impossible for the time. He would be the one to make the first ever computer-animated feature film. He threw himself into the work, so driven that he'd often sleep on the floor of the computer lab just to get a few more hours on the mainframe. He was trying to solve monumental problems. Back then, computers were great at drawing straight lines and sharp angles, but terrible at curves. And what is life, what is character, if not a collection of beautiful, imperfect curves? His first major project was a short film of his own left hand. He made a plaster mold of it, drew hundreds of tiny polygons all over its surface, then painstakingly entered the 3D coordinates of each one into a program he'd written. The result was groundbreaking. For the first time, a computer had rendered a complex, curved, organic shape that moved with lifelike intention. That short film, simply called Hand, became a landmark. It signaled that a new age of animation was dawning. This early work caught the attention of a filmmaker who, like Walt Disney, was obsessed with blending art and technology, George Lucas. Fresh off the massive success of Star Wars, Lucas hired Ed to lead a new computer division at Lucasfilm. His mission was simple but profound: bring high technology into the movie industry. This was Ed's first big leadership role, and it's where he learned one of his most enduring lessons. He needed to build a team of the brightest minds he could find. One of the first people he interviewed was a charismatic computer scientist named Alvy Ray Smith. And Ed felt a knot in his stomach. Alvy, he realized, was probably more qualified to lead the lab than he was. That primal, instinctual fear crept in. This is the guy who could take my job. Most people in that position would have passed. They'd have chosen someone less threatening, someone they could easily manage. But Ed remembered a lesson from ARPA, the government agency that had funded much of his university research. Their philosophy was simple. When faced with a huge challenge, don't build walls. Just get smarter. So Ed hired Alvy. He chose to bet on talent, even when it felt threatening. That single decision, he'd later say, changed him as a manager forever. By ignoring his fear, he learned his fear was groundless. He'd gained a brilliant collaborator, and he'd unlocked a core principle for building a great team. Always try to hire people who are smarter than you. This small group of pioneers at Lucasfilm was a creative furnace. They developed groundbreaking technology, including a powerful machine they called the Pixar image computer, and that's where the name was born. Alvy liked the fake Spanish verb, pixar, to make pictures. A colleague named Lauren suggested something more high-tech, like radar. They put them together. Pixar, radar, Pixar. It stuck. But even as they were building the future, Ed felt something was missing. They were a team of brilliant technologists, but they weren't storytellers. They had the world's most advanced paintbrush, but no artists to wield it. Meanwhile, George Lucas's focus was on using these tools to enhance live-action films, not on making fully animated movies. Their dream and his vision were beginning to diverge, and after a difficult divorce, Lucas needed to streamline his business. He decided to sell the computer division. What followed was a year of incredible stress. They were shopped around to dozens of companies, General Motors, Philips, and others. but no one would bite. The team Ed and Alvy had built was on the verge of being shut down. Their dream was about to die. And then they met Steve Jobs. At the time, Steve had just been forced out of Apple, the company he founded. He was looking for his next great adventure, and he was brilliant, intense, and utterly relentless. In one of their first meetings, Steve stood at a whiteboard, talking with a force that felt like a physical presence. Ed recalls feeling like the man in the old Maxell tape ads, hair blown back by the sheer volume coming from the speaker. Steve was the speaker. Everyone else was the guy in the chair. Steve's domineering nature could be breathtaking. At one point, he calmly told Ed that he wanted his job, explaining that once he took over, Ed would learn so much from him that in 2 years, he'd be ready to run the company himself. Of course, Ed was already running the company, but he marveled at the sheer audacity. But something else was happening. A conversation with Steve wasn't passive. It forced you to engage, to defend your ideas, to sharpen your own thinking. After months of tough negotiations, a deal was finally struck. In 1986, Steve Jobs bought the computer division from George Lucas for $5 million and invested another $5 million to fund it as a new, independent company, Pixar. On the day the papers were signed, Steve pulled Ed and Alvy aside, put his arms around them and said, "Whatever happens, we have to be loyal to each other." For a man still wounded by his ouster from Apple, it was a profound moment. The feisty little company called Pixar had been born, and they were all about to board the Steve Jobs roller coaster. The early days of Pixar were anything but glamorous. They were a hardware company trying to sell an incredibly powerful but wildly expensive machine, the Pixar image computer, and they had no idea how to do it. They were, as Ed says, drowning. Ed read every business book he could find, but most were filled with empty slogans like "focus, focus, focus," which, he realized, tells you to focus but gives you no clue what to focus on. The real lessons came from unexpected places. He became fascinated with the history of Japanese manufacturing, particularly Toyota. After World War II, Japanese goods were seen as cheap and inferior. But an American statistician named W. Edwards Deming introduced a radical idea. He argued that the responsibility for quality shouldn't rest with inspectors at the end of the line. It should belong to every single person on the line. At Toyota, they installed a cord that any worker could pull at any time to stop the entire assembly line if they spotted a problem. Think about how counterintuitive that is. The American model was, keep the line moving at all costs, because time is money. The Japanese model was, quality is the goal, and anyone can take responsibility for it. You don't have to ask permission to take responsibility. This idea became a beacon for Ed. It was about empowering people. It was about trusting that your employees have good intentions and giving them the freedom to solve problems without fear. But for years, Pixar hemorrhaged money. Their computer sales were dismal. The only thing keeping them afloat were infusions of cash from Steve Jobs, who, all told, sank over $50 million of his own money into the company. During this time, their small animation group, led by a young and brilliantly enthusiastic animator named John Lasseter, was producing award-winning short films like Luxo Jr., the story of 2 desk lamps that would eventually become the company's iconic logo, and Tin Toy, which won Pixar its first Oscar. These shorts weren't just side projects. They were proof that their technology could be used to tell stories that moved people. But they weren't a business model. Finally, in the early 1990s, They abandoned hardware and pivoted to what they'd dreamed of all along, making the first computer-animated feature film. They struck a 3-picture deal with Disney. The entertainment giant would finance and distribute the films, but Pixar would create them. The idea they landed on was one John Lasseter had been nursing for years, a story told from the point of view of toys that come to life when humans aren't around. The movie would be called Toy Story. The pressure was immense. No one had ever done this before. They were, as one person put it, assembling the parachute after they'd already jumped out of the plane. And they were getting a lot of notes from the executives at Disney. Jeffrey Katzenberg, then the head of Disney's film division, pushed them relentlessly for more edge. He thought the main character, Woody the cowboy, was too bland. So, being novices, they took the advice. And Woody slowly transformed. He became sarcastic, mean, and deeply unappealing. He wasn't the lovable leader of the toys. He was a jerk who bosses everyone around and, in a fit of jealousy, intentionally throws Buzz Lightyear out the window. On November 19, 1993, they took this version to Disney. That day would forever be known at Pixar as Black Friday. The reaction was so negative that Disney shut down the production entirely. The shutdown was terrifying. Their dream was on life support, but it was also a crucial turning point. John Lasseter and his core creative team, including a young writer-director named Andrew Stanton and a talented draftsman named Pete Docter, retreated. They had to rediscover the heart of their movie. And in doing so, they learned a vital lesson. They had to trust their own storytelling instincts. They rebuilt the story from the ground up, making Woody a flawed but fundamentally good character who's afraid of losing his place, not a tyrant who deserves to be overthrown. They found the movie's soul. When Toy Story was finally released in 1995, it was a phenomenon. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece. It became the top-grossing film of the year. The dream Ed Catmull had set for himself 2 decades earlier in a university computer lab had been achieved. And then something strange happened. Ed felt lost. He'd spent his entire professional life building a train and laying its track. Now that the train had reached its destination, the idea of just driving it, making one film after another, felt hollow. Is this all there is? He wondered. It was in this period of confusion that he found his new purpose. He'd watched so many brilliant Silicon Valley companies rise to glory and then do something stupid and flame out. He became determined to understand why. What were the hidden forces that caused smart people to make bad decisions? His new goal wasn't just to make more films. It was to build a creative culture that could last. He would devote himself to protecting Pixar from the unseen forces that ruined so many successful companies. And he would get his first major test almost immediately. As they began work on their second film, A Bug's Life, Ed discovered a deep, hidden rift inside the company. The production managers, the people responsible for schedules and budgets, told him that working on Toy Story had been a nightmare. They felt disrespected, marginalized, like second-class citizens. Meanwhile, the artists and technical staff saw the production managers as bureaucratic obstacles who stifled creativity. Ed was floored. How had he missed this? His door was always open, he thought, but no one had come to him. He learned a crucial lesson. The good stuff was hiding the bad stuff. People were so proud of the history they were making with Toy Story that they were reluctant to complain. When downsides coexist with upsides, people are afraid of being labeled complainers. He also discovered that the production managers had set up a rigid communication structure. To keep things organized, they'd insisted that all communication go through proper channels. An animator couldn't just walk over and talk to a modeler. They had to go through their managers. This, well-intentioned micromanaging, was infuriating the creative staff and creating massive roadblocks. So Ed and the leadership team gathered the company together and made a simple but revolutionary declaration. Going forward, anyone should be able to talk to anyone else, at any level, at any time, without fear of reprimand. They'd made the mistake of confusing the communication structure with the organizational structure. The free exchange of information was key. This was the beginning of Ed's journey to uncover what he calls the hidden, the vast universe of things going on in an organization that the leaders cannot see. A leader, he realized, must be constantly aware that their view is obstructed. People behave differently around the boss. Hierarchies create blind spots. And success itself is one of the most effective blinders of all, because it convinces you that you're doing everything right. If you don't try to uncover what is unseen, you'll be ill-prepared to lead. Out of the crucible of these early films, two defining mantras emerged at Pixar: story is king and trust the process. Story is king meant that nothing, not technology, not marketing, not merchandising, would ever get in the way of telling a great story. Trust the process was a reassurance that even when things got messy and chaotic, their unique way of working would carry them through. These phrases became their guiding lights. And then Toy Story 2 almost proved them wrong. The film started as a direct-to-video project. Disney had found that these sequels, made with lower budgets and lower artistic standards, were extremely lucrative. Pixar thought they could do it better, but they quickly realized they'd made a terrible mistake. They didn't know how to aim low. It created a toxic A-team versus B-team culture within the studio. The crew assigned to Toy Story 2 wasn't interested in making B-level work, so they went back to Disney and convinced them to make it a full theatrical release. But the core creative team from the first film was busy working on A Bug's Life, so they put two talented but first-time directors in charge. Everyone assumed that because the characters and world were already established, a sequel would be easier. They were wrong. A year into production, the film was in deep trouble. The story was hollow, the humor fell flat, and the new directors, lacking confidence, weren't gelling as a team. But everyone was so busy and so confident in their mantras that they kept telling themselves to just trust the process. The process didn't save them. After A Bug's Life was finished, John Lasseter finally sat down to watch the reels of Toy Story 2. He emerged a couple of hours later, walked into Ed's office, and shut the door. The word he used was disaster. What followed was a moment that would forge Pixar's true identity. They had a choice: release a mediocre film or do the unthinkable. They chose the unthinkable. Over the Christmas holiday, they decided to throw out the majority of the movie and start over, from scratch, with only 9 months left until the release date. It was the cinematic equivalent of a heart transplant. The first, painful step was to replace the directors. John Lasseter himself would now take the helm. Then they unleashed the full power of a group that had emerged organically during the making of the first Toy Story. They called it the braintrust. The braintrust is the core of Pixar's creative process. It's a group of their most experienced storytellers, directors, writers, and heads of story who gather every few months to review each film in progress. Its premise is simple: put smart, passionate people in a room, charge them with identifying and solving problems, and, most importantly, encourage them to be absolutely, unflinchingly candid with one another. But there are two key rules that make the braintrust magical. First, The braintrust is made up of peers. It's a filmmaker-led review, not a top-down executive review. These are people who've been in the director's chair themselves, who know how painful it is to have your work torn apart. Second, and this is crucial, the braintrust has no authority. The director doesn't have to take any of their suggestions. The group's job is to diagnose problems, not to prescribe solutions. They're there to hold up a mirror and show the director the problems they can no longer see for themselves. After the meeting, it's entirely up to the director and their team to figure out how to fix the film. This removes the power dynamics from the equation. The film itself is under the microscope, not the filmmaker. As Andrew Stanton likes to say, you are not your idea. If you identify too closely with your ideas, you'll take offense when they're challenged. The braintrust got to work on Toy Story 2. The original story was a simple escape saga. Woody is stolen by a toy collector, and the other toys have to rescue him. But the braintrust realized there was no real emotional dilemma. Of course, Woody would want to go home to Andy. They needed to make his choice a real one. They did it by adding 2 new characters. The first was Wheezy the Penguin, an old toy with a broken squeaker who's been sitting on a shelf, forgotten. Wheezy introduces the emotional stakes. Even the most beloved toys can get damaged and tossed aside. The second, and most important, was Jessie the cowgirl. Jessie had once been loved by a little girl named Emily, just as Woody was loved by Andy. But Emily grew up and abandoned her. Jessie's heartbreaking story, told in the unforgettable When She Loved Me sequence, presents Woody with an agonizing choice. He can go back to Andy, knowing that he'll one day be outgrown and discarded, or he can stay with Jessie and the others, to be preserved forever in a museum, admired but never loved. As the creative team put it to each other, would you choose to live forever without love? When you can feel the agony of that choice, you have a movie. The reboot of Toy Story 2 drove the workforce to the breaking point. They worked around the clock, 7 days a week. One exhausted artist, in a moment of terrifying distraction, forgot his infant child in the back of his car in the parking lot. Thankfully, the baby was okay, but the incident was a brutal wake-up call for Ed. He vowed they would never make a film that way again. The needs of the movie could never again outweigh the needs of their people. In the end, Toy Story 2 was released on time and was a massive success. Many critics even called it one of the rare sequels that surpassed the original. But the real victory was internal. The crisis had forced them to live their values. It had also taught them a profound lesson that would become another cornerstone of the Pixar philosophy. Remember those mantras, story is king, and trust the process. They'd given them false comfort. Trust the process, in particular, had morphed into assume the process will fix things for us. It had made them passive. Ed realized the truth. You don't trust the process. You trust the people. This led him to a fundamental insight, perhaps the most important one in the entire book. Getting the team right is the necessary precursor to getting the ideas right. He says, if you give a good idea to a mediocre team, they'll screw it up. If you give a mediocre idea to a brilliant team, they'll either fix it or throw it away and come up with something better. Ideas, he argues, aren't singular things that float in the ether. They're forged by people through thousands of decisions. The real magic isn't the idea, it's the team. People are more important than ideas. This focus on people and culture led Ed to another powerful concept, one that every creative person, every leader must confront: the relationship between what he calls the ugly baby and the hungry beast. The ugly baby is the new idea. It's fragile, unformed, and, frankly, not very pretty. Early on, all of Pixar's movies suck. That's not modesty, it's a fact. The first versions are awkward, incomplete, and vulnerable. They need time, patience, and nurturing to grow into something beautiful. They need protection. The hungry beast, on the other hand, is the giant, relentless machinery of a successful organization. It's the need for more product, more content, more revenue to justify the massive staff and infrastructure. The beast is always hungry, and it needs to be fed. The danger is that the beast's need for efficiency and predictability will overwhelm the delicate, messy, and unpredictable process of nurturing the ugly baby. The pressure to feed the beast leads to safe, derivative, unoriginal work. It leads to sequels and formulas because they're easier to produce and market. The job of a creative leader, Ed says, is to protect the ugly baby from the hungry beast. This doesn't mean isolating the new idea in a vacuum. It means creating a safe environment where it can be tested, challenged, and improved without being judged too quickly. It means populating meetings with idea protectors, not paper killers, people who look for the potential in an idea, not just its flaws. This philosophy is embodied in another one of Andrew Stanton's famous mantras: fail early and fail fast, and be wrong as fast as you can. For most of us, failure comes with a lot of baggage. From a young age, we're taught that failure is bad. It means you didn't prepare, you aren't smart enough. It's something to be ashamed of. But Ed argues this is fundamentally wrong. Mistakes aren't a necessary evil. They aren't evil at all. They're the inevitable consequence of doing something new. If you aren't experiencing failure, then you're making a far worse mistake. You're being driven by the desire to avoid it. The goal is to uncouple fear and failure, to create an environment where making mistakes doesn't strike terror into people's hearts. And the best way for a leader to do that is to talk openly about their own mistakes. This brings us back to the story of Toy Story 2 being deleted. 2 years of work, gone. It was a colossal failure of their backup systems. But what happened afterward? No one wasted time playing the blame game. No one was fired. Their priorities were simple. First, restore the film. Second, fix the backup systems. Third, put safeguards in place to prevent it from happening again. Finding the person responsible and punishing them wasn't on the list. That single event sent a powerful message throughout the company. Problems are for solving, not for blaming. It created trust. And trust, Ed says, is the best tool for driving out fear. How else does Pixar put these ideas into practice? They use a collection of powerful and sometimes unusual mechanisms to constantly challenge their own assumptions and broaden their view. One is the daily review session, known simply as dailies. Every morning, the animators on a film gather to show their incomplete work to the director and their peers. This requires incredible vulnerability. But the goal is to create a safe space where ego is checked at the door. The critiques are meticulous, but the spirit is supportive. After every presentation, no matter how rough, the room bursts into applause. Dailies are a master class in learning to see, in solving problems together, and in understanding that creativity is a group effort. Another is research trips. John Lasseter believes deeply that to create an authentic world, you have to experience it firsthand. If you rely too much on references from other movies, your work will be derivative. So for Ratatouille, the team went to Paris, dining in Michelin-starred restaurants and trudging through the sewers. For Up, they traveled to the remote Tepuy Mountains of Venezuela. For Finding Nemo, many of the crew became scuba certified. This isn't about getting every tiny fact right. It's about fueling inspiration and challenging your preconceptions. Authenticity, Ed says, comes through even if the audience knows nothing about the reality you're depicting. It just feels right. They also harness the power of limits. In any creative endeavor, the list of things you want to do is infinite. Limits, whether a budget or a deadline, force you to be creative. They force you to rethink your approach and find smarter ways to work. During the making of The Incredibles, the producer, John Walker, created a simple but brilliant system. He put a row of popsicle sticks on a wall. Each stick represented one person week of an animator's time. When the director, Brad Bird, would ask for a complex new scene, John could simply point to the wall and say, "Okay, you'll need another stick for that. Where are you going to take it from?" It made the invisible cost of a decision visible, tangible, and forced them to make smart trade-offs. And then there's Pixar University. Soon after Toy Story, Ed started a program to offer free classes to every employee during the workday. You can learn sculpting, painting, acting, computer programming, even belly dancing. The purpose was never to turn programmers into artists. It was about something deeper. It was about making everyone a beginner again. In a classroom, hierarchy vanishes. An animator sits next to an accountant, both humbled by the challenge of learning something new. It fosters respect, it builds unexpected connections, and it constantly reminds everyone that it's okay to not know, to be vulnerable, to be on the edge. It helps them recapture what Zen philosophy calls the beginner's mind, an openness to the new that is the very essence of creativity. In 2006, after years of a successful but often fraught partnership, Steve Jobs came to Ed and John with a stunning proposal. He was thinking of selling Pixar to Disney. The idea was terrifying. Pixar was their small, scrappy, independent yacht. Disney was a giant ocean liner. They were afraid of being swallowed, of having their unique culture crushed by a corporate behemoth. But a lot had changed at Disney. Michael Eisner, the CEO with whom Steve had clashed so publicly, was gone. The new CEO, Bob Iger, had reached out to Steve, and in their first dealings, had proven himself to be a man of action and integrity. Bob believed that animation was the lifeblood of Disney, and he saw that it was failing. He wanted Pixar's help to revive it. The deal they struck was extraordinary. Not only would Steve Jobs become Disney's largest individual shareholder, but Ed Catmull and John Lasseter would be put in charge of both Pixar and Disney Animation. It was the ultimate test of their principles. Could the culture they'd so carefully built at Pixar be applied to this struggling giant? When they arrived at Disney Animation in Burbank, they found a culture gripped by fear. People were afraid to speak up, afraid to make mistakes. We've already heard about the sterile, impersonal desks. They also found a building whose very architecture seemed designed to stifle collaboration. The executive suite was on the top floor, set off by an imposing portal. The animators were in dungeon-like floors below. Their first acts were symbolic but powerful. They tore down the executive suite and turned it into open story rooms. They moved their own offices to the middle of the building and kept their blinds open. They created a central gathering place with a coffee bar to encourage those accidental encounters Steve Jobs so valued. They sent a clear message: we're tearing down the walls, literal and figurative. Then they got to work on the processes. They eliminated the mandatory top-down notes system that had crippled the directors. They established a Disney version of the braintrust, which they called the story trust, and began the long, patient process of teaching a culture of candor. One of their most critical decisions was to keep the two studios completely separate. No sharing of production staff, no matter how dire the crisis. Why? Because they wanted each studio to learn to solve its own problems. If you make it easy to borrow resources, you mask the underlying issues. You have to force problems to the surface so you can face them. This policy was tested almost immediately, first on Pixar's Ratatouille and then on Disney's Bolt. In both cases, the production teams were in crisis and begged to borrow animators from the other studio. In both cases, Ed and John said no. And in both cases, the teams, forced to rely on themselves, dug deep and found creative solutions they never would have discovered otherwise. They learned they could solve their own problems. They learned they could be great. Slowly, painstakingly, the ship began to turn. Disney Animation, which hadn't had a #1 hit in 16 years, released Tangled in 2010. It was a runaway success, both critically and commercially. It was followed by the triumph of Wreck-It Ralph, and then the global phenomenon of Frozen. The creative culture at Disney Animation was fundamentally reborn. They'd proven that their principles weren't just Pixar magic. They were universal truths about how to manage a creative culture. This brings us to one final, powerful story. By 2013, Pixar had an unbroken string of 14 #1 movies. They were on top of the world, but Ed and the leadership team were worried. Success, they knew, can breed complacency. Had they gotten too comfortable? Were people holding back, afraid to rock the boat? Was the fear of being the one to break the streak stifling risk-taking? At an off-site retreat, they were grappling with this when Guido Quaroni, the head of their software tools department, shared an idea. He'd started giving his engineers personal project days, 2 days a month, where they could work on anything they wanted. You just give people the time, he said, and they come up with the ideas. This sparked a bigger thought. John Lasseter said, "What if we closed Pixar for the day? Everybody comes to work, but all we'll talk about is how to solve our problems." And so, Notes Day was born. It wasn't just a day of brainstorming. It was a meticulously designed exercise in tapping the collective brain power of the entire company. They created an electronic suggestion box, and thousands of ideas poured in. They distilled these into over 100 discussion topics, everything from highly technical issues to broad cultural questions like, how can we return to a good ideas come from anywhere culture? The single most popular topic, a radical proposal to try and make one of their films for a drastically lower budget. People weren't just willing to engage with the company's problems, they were hungry to. On March 11, 2013, the entire company gathered in the atrium of the Steve Jobs building. And John Lasseter kicked off the day with one of the most vulnerable and powerful acts of leadership imaginable. He told everyone that in preparation for Notes Day, he'd asked for feedback on his own performance. He thought he'd get a page. He got 2.5 pages of tough, candid criticism about his time management, about how he carried the stress of one meeting into the next. It was really tough to read, he told the silent crowd, but it was so valuable for me to hear. He then implored everyone, please be honest. Put your tough skin on, and for the sake of Pixar, don't stop the honesty. By making himself vulnerable, he made it safe for everyone else to do the same. The day was electric. People from different departments who'd never met were suddenly sitting together, passionately hashing out solutions to the company's biggest challenges. It broke down silos. It fostered empathy. It reminded everyone that they were all part owners of the culture. Notes Day didn't solve everything, but it did something more important. It made it safe again to speak up. It reinvigorated the very soul of the company. When you step back and look at the story of Creativity, Inc., what you see is a powerful and deeply human journey. It's a book about how to make great movies, yes, but on a deeper level, it's about how to build an environment where people can do their best work. It's a testament to the idea that the most important thing a leader can do is create a culture of trust. The lessons Ed Catmull shares aren't quick fixes or management fads. They're profound, timeless principles rooted in a deep respect for people and the creative process. The idea that all new things start as ugly babies and need protection is a game changer. It gives us permission to be imperfect, to start small, to iterate. It frees us from the tyranny of having to be brilliant on the first try. Similarly, the concept of the hidden, of acknowledging that we're all operating with incomplete information and that our own mental models are flawed, is an incredible call for humility. It pushes us to listen more, to seek out different perspectives, and to be open to the humbling reality that we don't have all the answers. This isn't a sign of weakness, it's the foundation of true strength and adaptability. What I find most inspiring about this book is its relentless focus on people. In a world that's often obsessed with metrics, processes, and outcomes, Catmull consistently brings it back to the human element. Trust the people, not the process. People are more important than ideas. These aren't just feel-good platitudes. They're battle-tested strategies that have produced some of the most successful and beloved creative work of our time. So how can we start to apply these powerful ideas in our own lives, starting today? Here are a few simple starting points. First, create your own mini brain trust. Find a small group of people you trust, friends, colleagues, mentors, who you can show your ugly babies to. These should be people who you know will be candid but supportive, who will help you see the flaws in your work without crushing your spirit. Make it a regular practice. Second, conduct a post-mortem on your next project, big or small. When it's finished, take a moment with your team, or even just by yourself, and list 5 things you'd do again and 5 things you wouldn't. Consolidate what you've learned. This simple act of reflection is one of the most powerful tools for growth. And third, look for a hidden problem. Catmull tells a wonderful story about a long, skinny conference table at Pixar that was chosen by Steve Jobs. It looked beautiful, but it was terrible for collaboration. It created a hierarchy and discouraged people from speaking up. But because it was Steve's table, no one questioned it for years. What's the equivalent of that long table in your work, your team, or your life? What's the unseen force that's holding you back? Just asking the question is the first step to uncovering it. That was a look at Creativity, Inc. by Ed Catmull. We've journeyed through the core ideas today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you make the journey yourself. The true magic happens in the quiet moments of reading, when a particular story or a simple phrase connects with your own experience in a way you didn't expect. This podcast is here to help you decide if this book is a journey worth taking. If anything we've talked about today has sparked a fire in you, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see your work, your team, and the creative potential within yourself. You can find a link to the book in the show notes. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please do me a small favor and hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Your support means the world, and it allows us to keep exploring these incredible ideas together. Let's keep growing.